The papers hit the stone floor with a sound like wings folding, and by the time Lyra Ashford realized what she had dropped, the eastern sky was already bruising toward dawn, and she was 3 kilometers away in her rented room above the bakery, too tired to remember anything but the smell of old vellum and the way her coat pocket had felt lighter as she locked the archive door behind her. The bundle had slipped free somewhere between the Maritime Records room and the main hall, scattering across flagstones that had been laid down when the Breton coast still belonged to duchies and sea lords. Lyra had been working late again, cataloging shipping manifests from the 1820s for the Grimwald Archives digitization project, a contract position that paid poorly but came with lodging stipend and unlimited access to historical documents, which was all she had wanted for the past 4 years. She did not notice the empty pocket. She did not notice the letters spreading like a fan of accusation across the floor, each envelope addressed in her own cramped handwriting to a name that no longer answered. The Grimwald Archive was not technically a public institution. It belonged to the Grimwald family, an old Breton lineage whose wealth had survived revolution, occupation, and modernity by the simple expedient of never appearing to have very much of it. The estate sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, a sprawling manor of gray stone and narrow windows that had been partially converted to house the collection sometime in the 19th century. Tourists were not invited. Scholars applied months in advance and were often refused. Lyra had been hired because her references were impeccable, and her research proposal was narrow enough to seem harmless. A comparative study of merchant vessel routes before and after the Napoleonic Wars focused on a single shipping company that had operated out of St. Malo. She had lied in her application. The shipping company was real, and so was her academic interest. But the reason she had chosen that particular company was because it was the one that had employed her fiancé when he died. His name had been Thomas Brennan. He had been a maritime historian, like her, and they had met at a conference in Dover where he had presented a paper on smuggling networks, and she had asked a question sharp enough to make him laugh. They had been engaged for 8 months when he took a research trip to Brittany to examine records held in private collections. He had written to her every 3 days. Then the letters stopped, and a week later his supervisor called to say that Thomas had drowned in a sailing accident off the coast, that his body had been recovered and buried in a local churchyard, and that everyone was terribly sorry. That had been 4 years ago. Lyra had gone to the funeral, met his parents, spoken to the supervisor who had made the call. The story was consistent. Thomas had gone out on a small hired boat to photograph coastal landmarks relevant to his research. The weather had turned. The boat had capsized. A fisherman had found the body 2 days later. She had not believed it, not entirely, but belief was not the same as proof, and grief was not the same as clarity. So she had done what made sense to her. She had finished her doctorate, published her dissertation, and applied for every position that would let her access the records Thomas had been studying when he died. The Grimwald Archive had been her 3rd attempt and the first to say yes. And once a month for 4 years she had written him a letter. She told him about her research, about the places she had lived, about the small futile angers and moments of beauty that made up a life spent trying to finish someone else's work. She did not mail them. She kept them in a bundle tied with kitchen string, and she carried them with her when she moved, which was often, and sometimes she took them out and read them aloud in empty rooms just to hear the shape of his name. She had brought them to Brittany. She had carried them in her coat pocket on the nights when the archive felt too silent and the wind off the ocean sounded like drowning. And tonight, exhausted and ink-stained and late, she had let them slip free without noticing. The man who found them was not supposed to be in the building. Harthos Grimwald did not live at the estate, had not lived there in any meaningful sense for 2 centuries, but he still kept rooms in the old wing and he still walked the archive halls on certain nights when the court was not in session and the human staff had gone home. He was, among other things, the reason the archive existed at all. His family's collection had begun as his personal library back when books were written by hand and a single codex could cost a year's income. He had built the Maritime Room, he had acquired the maps, and he had spent a great deal of the last 400 years ensuring that specific records were preserved, catalogued, and kept out of reach of anyone who might ask the wrong questions. He was also the king of the Breton vampire court, though the title was a courtesy and the court itself was small, old, and mostly concerned with making sure that none of its members did anything interesting enough to attract attention. They met once a season in the halls beneath the estate, resolved disputes over territory and feeding rights, and otherwise left one another alone. It was a quiet existence which suited Harthos. He had spent the loud centuries, he preferred the archival ones. He came up from the lower halls just before dawn, intending to retrieve a letter he had misfiled in the 1700s correspondence, and found the scattered pages in the main hall. At first he thought they were archive documents, misfiled or dropped by one of the catalogers, and he knelt to gather them with the automatic care of someone who had spent lifetimes handling fragile paper. Then he saw the first line of the top letter and stopped. "Dear Thomas, it is April again, and I am still angry." He should have simply gathered them, left them on the desk in the front room where lost items were kept, and gone to ground before the sun rose. That would have been the correct thing to do, the respectful thing, the thing any decent person would have done when confronted with someone else's private correspondence. Harthos Grimwald had lived for 463 years, and he had not remained king of even a small and quiet court by being careless. So instead of leaving them, he read the date on the envelope, noted the name, and carried the entire bundle down to his quarters below the estate where the sun could not reach, and the stone walls were carved with words older than the manor above. Then he sat in a chair that had belonged to a Maréchal of France, lit a lamp that burned oil rendered from a process nobody living quite remembered, and read every single letter before the sun finished rising. By the time dawn broke fully over the Atlantic, Harthos knew three things with absolute certainty. First, that Lyra Ashford was the cataloger who had been hired 6 months ago to work on the maritime records, and who kept to herself and stayed late and never asked for access to anything she had not been explicitly assigned. Second, that Thomas Brennan had not drowned in a sailing accident. And third, that Harthos himself had signed the order that buried the real circumstances of Thomas Brennan's death, and that he had done so knowingly, and that he was now holding in his hands the grief of a woman who had spent 4 years writing to a dead man because no one had told her the truth. He set the letters down on the table very carefully and spent a long time looking at them. Then he took up a pen and he began to write in the margins. Lyra discovered the letters were missing at breakfast, which she ate standing up in her small room because sitting down felt like admitting the day had properly started. She had a cup of tea, a piece of bread with butter, and a slow dawning sense of horror as she checked her coat pockets and found them empty. She tore the room apart. She checked every pocket, every bag, every surface. She retraced her evening in her mind, trying to remember when she had last felt the weight of the bundle, and came up blank. She had been tired. She had been working in 3 different rooms. She had been thinking about a manifest entry that did not match the harbor records, and she had not been paying attention to anything except the work. She walked back to the archive so fast she was nearly running by the time she reached the gates, and she did not stop to admire the view or notice the way the morning light turned the stone walls silver. The front door was locked, which it always was until 9 when the senior archivist arrived, but Lyra had been given a key for the side entrance that the staff used, and she let herself in and went straight to the main hall where she had been working the night before. The letters were not on the floor. They were not on any of the tables. They were not in the maritime room or the corridor, or tucked behind a shelf where they might have blown. Lyra searched for 20 minutes, growing progressively more desperate, until she heard footsteps and turned to find the senior archivist standing in the doorway with a look of polite concern. His name was Bastien. He had worked at the archive for 30 years, and he had the kind of patient, weathered face that made you want to confess things. "Mademoiselle Ashford," he said, "you are here early." "I lost something," Lyra said, which was both true and entirely inadequate. "Last night I think I dropped papers, personal papers. Did anyone find anything?" Bastien frowned. "I have not seen anything. Where were you working?" "Here in the maritime room in the storage annex." She was trying very hard to keep her voice level. "A bundle of letters, tied with string. They are mine. They are not archive documents. I had them in my pocket, and I think they fell." "I will look," Bastien said, with the kindness of someone who understood that personal disasters did not have to make sense. "If they are here, I will find them. Come back this afternoon, yes?" Lyra nodded because there was nothing else to do, and went back to her room and spent the rest of the morning staring at the wall and trying not to imagine a stranger reading 4 years of grief written in her own handwriting. The thought made her feel sick. The letters were private, more private than a diary, because they were addressed to someone who could not answer. She had written things in those letters that she had never said aloud. She had been honest in a way she could not afford to be with anyone living. And now they were gone, and someone had them, and she could not even explain why it mattered so much without sounding unhinged. She did not go back to the archive that afternoon. She could not make herself do it. Instead, she walked along the cliffs, watching the sea and thinking about Thomas and wondering if this was some kind of cosmic joke, losing the letters in the same place he had died. When she finally returned to the archive the next day, there was a note waiting for her at the front desk. It was written on heavy paper and handwriting that looked like it belonged in a museum display, and it said only, "Your letters have been found. I will return them tonight. Please meet me in the main hall at 8 o'clock. H. Grimwald." Lyra read the note 3 times. The Grimwalds owned the estate, she knew that much, but she had never met any of them. The archive was managed by Bastien and a small staff, and as far as she knew, the family had no direct involvement in the day-to-day operations. She had assumed they lived elsewhere, or were dead, or simply uninterested. Apparently, she had been wrong. She spent the rest of the day trying to work and failing, distracted by the thought of the evening meeting, and the fact that someone named H. Grimwald had her letters and was going to return them personally, which seemed either very formal or very ominous, and she could not decide which. At 8 o'clock she was standing in the main hall, watching the last of the daylight fade through the narrow windows, when she heard footsteps on the stairs that led down to the lower levels. The man who appeared was not what she had expected. She had been picturing an elderly scholar, perhaps, or a bureaucrat in a suit. Instead, H. Grimwald was young or looked young, which she would later learn was not the same thing, and he was dressed like someone who had walked out of an old portrait and forgotten to change. Dark coat, high collar, pale skin, paler hair that fell to his shoulders. He moved with the kind of absolute confidence that suggested he had never been unsure of anything in his life, and when he looked at her, his eyes were the color of winter storms. He was carrying her letters in one hand, tied neatly with the same string she had used, and he stopped a careful distance away and inclined his head in something that might have been a bow, or might simply have been acknowledgement. "Mademoiselle Ashford," he said, and his voice was low and accented in a way she could not quite place, French but older, shaped by centuries of sound. "I apologize for the delay in returning these. I found them yesterday morning." Lyra stared at him, then at the letters, then back at him. "You found them," she said slowly. "Yes, and you are returning them now." "Yes, a full day later." He did not flinch. "Yes, did you read them?" There was a pause, and in that pause Lyra felt her stomach drop because she already knew the answer, and she could not decide if she wanted to scream or cry or simply walk into the ocean. "I did," Harthos said. He did not apologize. He did not look away. He simply stood there holding her letters and told her the truth in a voice that offered no excuses. "You had no right," Lyra said, and her voice came out shaking, not with tears but with fury. "Those were private, they were mine. You had absolutely no right." "No," Harthos agreed. "I did not." "Then why did you?" He held out the bundle. "Because the story you were told about Thomas Brennan's death is not true, and I thought you deserved to know." The world tilted. Lyra took a step back without meaning to, and Harthos remained perfectly still, watching her with an expression that might have been sympathy or might simply have been patience. "What are you talking about?" Lyra said. "Take the letters," Harthos said. "I have annotated them. Read what I have written, and then decide whether you want to speak to me again." He set the bundle on the table between them, turned, and walked back toward the stairs before she could say anything else. Lyra stood frozen, staring at the letters, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then she grabbed the bundle and ran. She did not stop until she was back in her room with the door locked and the curtains drawn. Then she sat on the bed, untied the string with shaking hands, and opened the first letter. Her own words stared back at her, written 4 years ago in the numb first weeks after the funeral. "Dear Thomas, they say you drowned, but you were always careful on the water, and I do not understand how this happened." And in the margin, in that same museum script handwriting, a single line. "He did not drown, the boat was sabotaged." Lyra stopped breathing. She flipped to the second letter, written a month later. "Dear Thomas, I went to the churchyard today. Your parents were there. Your mother says she is glad you were doing what you loved. I did not tell her that I think something is wrong." Margin note. "You were correct. He discovered evidence of a smuggling operation using falsified maritime records. The operation was protected by a member of this court." Third letter, 2 months after the funeral. "Dear Thomas, I have been looking at the records from your last trip. You were researching the St. Malo shipping companies. You wrote to me about a discrepancy in the logs from 1809. You said it was strange that a ship listed as lost in a storm had cargo manifests filed 6 months later. Margin note. The ship was used to transport humans for feeding. The manifests were altered by an elder named Corentin, who has held power in this region for 300 years. Your fiancé found the original logs." Lyra read every letter and every margin note, and by the time she finished, the sky outside was full dark and she was crying so hard she could barely see the pages. Thomas had not drowned. Thomas had been killed deliberately, because he had found evidence of something the vampires wanted hidden, and the man who had just handed her proof of that murder was apparently one of those vampires, and he had admitted it without hesitation or pretense, and she had no idea what to do with that information. She also had no idea why he had told her. If he was part of the cover-up, if he had been involved in Thomas's death, why give her the truth now? Why annotate her letters with evidence that could destroy him? The last letter in the bundle was the one she had written 2 weeks ago, the most recent one, the one where she had admitted that she was tired of being angry and she did not know how to let go. The margin note on that letter was longer than the others. Thomas Brennan was killed on my orders. Not directly, I did not strike the blow, but I signed the order to silence him and dispose of the evidence. I did so to protect a peace that had taken decades to build, and to avoid a purge that would have killed half the humans in this region. Corentin is beloved by the court, and proof of his crimes would have fractured alliances that keep this coast stable. I chose the lives of hundreds over the life of one man, and I have made that choice before, and I would make it again if I had to. But you deserve to know. And I am sorry. It was signed with initials, H.G. Lyra set the letter down and pressed her hands over her face and tried to breathe through the horrible tangle of grief and rage and something else she did not have a name for. He had killed Thomas. He had admitted it. He had given her proof in his own handwriting, and he had apologized, which felt both utterly inadequate and strangely devastating, because apologies were supposed to be easy and this one had clearly cost him something. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the bed with the letters spread around her and tried to decide what to do. She could go to the police, but what would she say? She had no body, no physical evidence, just a bundle of annotated love letters written by a vampire who had confessed to murder. She could leave, get on a train and never come back, but that felt like giving up, and she had not spent 4 years chasing answers just to run when she finally found them, or she could go back to the archive and demand the rest of the story. At dawn, she made her decision. She waited until evening because the note had specified 8 o'clock and some part of her assumed that meant something, and because she needed the daylight hours to think and plan and decide whether she was brave or just stupid. Then she walked to the archive, let herself in through the side door, and found Harthos Grimwald already waiting in the main hall. He looked exactly the same as he had the night before, which should not have been surprising but somehow was. He was standing near the windows, staring out at the ocean, and he turned when she entered with the kind of precision that suggested he had heard her coming from 3 rooms away. "Mademoiselle Ashford," he said quietly. "You killed him," Lyra said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "Yes. Why are you telling me this?" Harthos regarded her for a long moment. "Because you spent 4 years writing to a dead man and you deserve to know why he died." "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." Lyra crossed her arms. She was standing in a darkened archive hall with a vampire who had just confessed to murder, and some distant rational part of her brain was suggesting that she should be afraid, but mostly she just felt furious and exhausted. "Who is Corentin?" "An elder of this court. He has held territory along this coast since the 1600s. He is well connected, well liked, and responsible for maintaining the feeding agreements that keep this region peaceful." "Feeding agreements," Lyra repeated. "Arrangements with human families who provide blood in exchange for protection and money. Corentin manages most of the contracts in this area. Without him, the system collapses and vampires start hunting freely, which means deaths, which means hunters, which means war." Lyra felt sick. "So you let him kill Thomas to keep the peace?" "I let him cover up a crime Thomas discovered, yes." Thomas found evidence that Corentin was using his shipping access to transport humans illegally, selling them to courts in other regions. It was a violation of our laws and of the agreements we have with the human authorities who know we exist. If that evidence became public, Corentin would have been executed, and the families he managed would have broken their contracts, and the court would have fractured. "I made a calculation. You chose a monster over a good man. I chose many lives over one life," Harthos said, and his voice was still calm, still even, but there was something underneath it now, something that might have been anger or might have been pain. "I have made that choice 100 times, Mademoiselle Ashford. It is what kings do." "Do not call me that," Lyra snapped. "If you are going to admit to murdering my fiancé, you can at least use my first name." Harthos inclined his head. "Lyra, then." She hated that it sounded right in his voice, formal and careful, and weighted with something she did not want to examine. "What happens now?" "That," Harthos said, "is entirely up to you." Lyra stared at him. "What is that supposed to mean? I have given you the truth. What you do with it is your decision. If you want justice, I will arrange it. If you want revenge, I will not stop you. If you want to walk away and never speak of this again, I will make sure you are safe and compensated and left alone." "You will arrange justice," Lyra said slowly. "You are offering to help me bring charges against yourself." "Why?" For the first time, Harthos looked away. He turned back toward the window, his profile sharp against the dim light, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter. "Because I have lived for a very long time, and I have done many things I am not proud of, and I am tired of carrying them alone. And because you loved him, and you have been grieving him for 4 years, and you deserve better than lies." Lyra did not know what to say to that. She stood there in the archive hall, surrounded by centuries of recorded history, and tried to make sense of a vampire king who had confessed to murder and then offered to face consequences for it. "What kind of justice are you talking about?" she asked finally. "A formal inquest. The court convenes once a season." The next session is in 3 weeks. I can bring charges against Corentin, present the evidence Thomas gathered, and allow the court to pass judgment. You would be permitted to testify if you wished. The process would be public by our standards. Other courts would be informed. If Corentin is found guilty, he will be executed, and the families under his management will be reassigned. And you? Lyra asked. You said you gave the order to cover it up. What happens to you? Harthos's expression did not change. That would also be for the court to decide. They could execute you. Yes. Lyra felt something twist in her chest, sharp and uncomfortable. Why would you risk that? Because it is the right thing to do, Harthos said simply. And because you asked. They stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the conversation settling between them like stone. Finally, Lyra said, I need time to think, of course. Harthos turned to face her fully, and his expression was open in a way that felt almost painful. The archive is yours to use as you wish. Bastien has been instructed to give you access to any records you request. If you have questions, I will answer them. If you want to leave, I will arrange transportation and see that you are paid for the full term of your contract. You are not a prisoner here, Lyra. You have never been. Was I ever safe here, she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Yes, Harthos said, and there was no hesitation in his answer. You were always safe. I made certain of it. Lyra nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and walked out of the hall before the tears could start again. Over the next 2 weeks, Lyra did 3 things. First, she read everything the archive held on vampire law, court structure, and the history of the Breton region. Second, she tracked down every record she could find related to Thomas's research, reconstructing his work and understanding, finally, what he had discovered. And third, she talked to Harthos. They met in the evenings. After the human staff had gone home and the archive was quiet, Harthos answered every question she asked, no matter how blunt or painful. He explained the court system, the feeding agreements, the delicate balance of power that kept the vampire population hidden and relatively peaceful. He told her about Corentin, about the families who depended on his management, about the political alliances that had taken decades to build. He did not defend his decision to cover up Thomas's death, but he did not apologize for it again either. He simply gave her the context and let her draw her own conclusions. Lyra hated that she was starting to understand. She hated that the more she learned, the more complicated the situation became, until it was no longer a simple story of good and evil but a messy tangle of impossible choices and competing responsibilities. Thomas had been good and kind, and he had not deserved to die. But Corentin's execution would destabilize the region, and the humans who depended on the current system would suffer for it. How many families are under his management? She asked one evening. They were sitting in the small reading room off the main hall, surrounded by maps and ledgers. 47, Harthos said. Approximately 200 individuals, including children. Lyra closed her eyes. And if Corentin is executed, what happens to them? They would be reassigned to other managers, but the process takes time, and there would be gaps in protection. Some families would refuse reassignment out of loyalty to Corentin. Those families would lose their contracts and the income that comes with them. In a region like this, that income is often the difference between stability and poverty, so people would suffer. Yes, because I want justice for Thomas. Harthos looked at her, and his expression was unbearably gentle. Because Thomas deserved justice, and because the system that killed him is broken. You are not responsible for the consequences of exposing that. Corentin is, I am. You keep saying that, Lyra said, but it does not make me feel better. It is not meant to make you feel better. It is meant to be true. She wanted to hate him. It would have been easier if she could hate him. If he were a monster she could simply despise and walk away from. But he was not. He was careful and honest, and every time she demanded an answer he gave it without hesitation, even when the answer made him look worse. He was also clearly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with carrying too much for too long. How old are you? She asked one night, when they had been sitting in silence for a long time. 463. Lyra tried to imagine it and could not. That is a long time to be king. I was not always king. I was turned in 1562 during the Wars of Religion. I became king in 1680, after the previous ruler was executed for losing control of his court. I have held the position since then because no one else wants it, and I am too stubborn to step down. There was something almost wry in his voice, and Lyra found herself almost smiling despite everything. Do you want to step down sometimes? Harthos admitted. But kings do not get to quit because they are tired. Why not? Because someone has to hold the line, and I am the one who has been holding it. Lyra studied him in the lamplight, taking in the pale hair, the stark features, the way he held himself like a man carved from stone. You look like you belong in a painting. I have sat for several. They are all hideous. This time she did smile, small and brief, and Harthos's expression softened in response. They did not talk about the inquest that night. They talked about art and history and the way the ocean sounded different in winter. It was the first conversation they had that felt almost normal, and Lyra left the archive that evening feeling lighter than she had in days. By the end of the second week, she had made her decision. "I want the inquest," she told Harthos. They were standing in the main hall, the same place where he had returned her letters, and the symmetry felt deliberate. "I want Corentin judged. I want the truth on record, but I do not want the families to suffer for it." Harthos nodded. "I will arrange for their contracts to be transferred immediately before the inquest is held. It will be difficult, but it can be done." "And you?" Lyra asked. "What happens to you?" "I will testify. I will accept the court's judgment, even if they decide to execute you." "Yes." Lyra took a breath. "I do not want that." Harthos went very still. "Lyra, I do not want you to die," she said, and the words came out fiercer than she intended. "Thomas is dead, and nothing will change that. And I am angry, and I am grieving, and I will probably be both of those things for a very long time. But you told me the truth when you did not have to. You have answered every question I asked. You are trying to fix a system you did not break. And if the court decides to execute you for doing the right thing, then the system is even more broken than I thought. The court may not see it that way. Then I will testify on your behalf," Lyra said. "I will tell them that you confessed, that you gave me evidence, that you are trying to make this right. That has to count for something." Harthos looked at her for a long time, and she could not read his expression. Finally he said, "Why would you do that?" "Because you asked me what I wanted, and what I want is the truth, and accountability, and a system that does not sacrifice good people to keep monsters comfortable." And because she stopped, swallowed, made herself finish. "Because I think you are trying to be better than the choices you have made, and I think that matters." Harthos crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and for a moment Lyra thought he might touch her, reach out, close the distance that had been growing smaller every evening they spent talking. But he stopped just short, his hands curled at his sides, and his voice when he spoke was rough. "You are extraordinary," he said, "and I do not deserve your mercy." "Probably not," Lyra agreed. "But I am giving it to you anyway." The inquest was held 3 weeks later, in the halls beneath the estate where the court convened. Lyra had never been below ground in the archive before, and she was not prepared for the scale of it. The halls were vast, carved from living stone and lit with lamps that burned without smoke. There were chambers for records, for deliberation, for private meetings, and at the center of it all, a great hall with a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with 6 that looked like they had been carved by hand over centuries. The court was small, as Harthos had said, but the vampires who attended were not. They were old and powerful, and they watched Lyra with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. She was the only human in the room, and she felt it like a weight. Harthos presided, because he was still king and the inquest was his to convene. He sat at the center of a raised dais, flanked by 2 elders who served as advisors, and he conducted the proceedings with a formality that made him seem even more distant than usual. Lyra sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap, and watched as the evidence was presented. Thomas's research was entered into the record, the falsified shipping manifests, the testimony of a dock worker who had been paid to stay silent, the orders Harthos had signed authorizing the cover-up, and finally Corentin himself, who stood in the center of the hall and denied nothing. He was tall, elegant, and utterly unrepentant. He admitted to the smuggling, to the illegal transport of humans, to arranging Thomas's death. He argued that his work had been for the good of the court, that the income from the smuggling had funded improvements to the feeding agreements, that Thomas Brennan had been a threat to stability and had been dealt with accordingly. "I acted in the best interests of this court," Corentin said, his voice carrying through the hall, "and I would do so again." The court erupted. Some vampires shouted support for Corentin, others called for his execution, and Harthos let it continue for a full minute before calling for silence. "You have confessed to crimes against our laws and against the agreements that govern our relations with the human world," Harthos said, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You have put this court at risk. You have killed a human who was under no contract and posed no threat beyond discovering the truth, and you have done so without remorse. What defense do you offer?" "I offer the defense of necessity," Corentin said, "and I offer the reminder that you, my king, approved the cover-up. If I am guilty, so are you." The hall went silent. Harthos did not flinch. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." He stood, and the movement was so sudden and so deliberate that every eye in the room turned to him. "I authorized the suppression of evidence. I ordered silence. I chose the stability of this court over the life of an innocent man. I did so knowingly, and I take full responsibility for that choice. If this court finds Corentin guilty, then it must also pass judgment on me." The hall erupted again, louder this time, and Lyra realized with a jolt that half the court was shouting in outrage and the other half was shouting in support, and no one seemed to know which side Harthos was on. I call for testimony, Harthos said, and the hall fell silent again. Lyra Ashford, come forward. Lyra stood on shaking legs and walked to the center of the hall. She had prepared for this, had written notes and rehearsed what she wanted to say. But now that she was standing in front of 24 vampires who looked at her like she was either prey or an inconvenience, all of her words fled. Speak, Harthos said, and his voice was gentler than it had been all evening. Lyra took a breath. My name is Lyra Ashford. 4 years ago, my fiancé, Thomas Brennan, was killed because he discovered evidence of crimes committed by a member of this court. I was told he drowned. I was lied to by people I trusted, and I spent 4 years grieving a man whose death I did not understand. She looked at Corentin, then at Harthos, then back at the assembled court. 3 weeks ago, Harthos Grimwald gave me the truth. He did not have to. He could have let me keep believing the lie. But he told me what happened, and he gave me evidence, and he offered to face consequences for his role in the cover-up. That is why I am here. Not because I want revenge, but because I want the truth on record, and I want a system that does not protect monsters at the expense of good people. She turned to Harthos. Thomas was a good man. He was kind and brilliant, and he believed that history mattered because it taught us how to be better. He would have hated that his death was used to justify more lies. But I think, her voice caught and she forced herself to continue. I think he would have understood that trying to fix a broken system is harder than just burning it down. And I think he would have believed that people who are trying to do better deserve a chance to prove it. She looked back at the court. Corentin has shown no remorse. He has admitted to his crimes and said he would do it again. That is not someone trying to do better. That is someone who believes he is above the law. But Harthos confessed. He gave me evidence. He convened this inquest knowing it could cost him everything. If you execute him for trying to make things right, then you are telling every member of this court that honesty is a weakness and that the only way to survive is to keep lying. Is that the precedent you want to set? She stepped back, her heart pounding, and waited. The court deliberated for 2 hours. Lyra was not allowed to stay for the deliberation, so she waited in one of the side chambers with a cup of tea that she did not drink and a view of the stone wall that told her nothing. When the doors finally opened and Harthos came to find her, she knew the answer before he spoke. Corentin has been found guilty, he said. He will be executed at dawn. The families under his management have been reassigned, and reparations have been ordered for the humans who were trafficked. Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. And you? I have been formally censured. The court agrees that I acted to preserve stability, but that the cover-up was a violation of our laws. I will remain king, but I am required to establish a public record system for any future incidents involving human deaths. The archive will be expanded to include a reading room accessible to human families, and you have been appointed as its director. Lyra blinked. What? The court agrees that oversight is necessary. You are qualified, you understand the stakes, and you are trusted by the human community. If you accept the position, you will have full access to court records, the authority to investigate any incident involving humans, and the protection of the court. Lyra did not know what to say. I need to think about it. Of course. Harthos's expression softened. You do not have to decide now. What happens to Corentin's estate? It will be liquidated. The proceeds will go to the families he harmed, including Thomas's parents. Lyra nodded and felt the weight of the past 4 years finally start to lift. It was not closure, not really. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a step toward justice. Thank you, she said quietly. Harthos shook his head. You are the one who demanded this. I only provided the venue. You provided more than that, Lyra said. You gave me the truth. You risked everything to make this happen. That matters. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Harthos said, There is something else I need to tell you. Lyra waited. I read your letters, Harthos said, and his voice was careful, deliberate. All of them. And I know that you love Thomas, and that you will carry that grief for a long time, and that I have no right to ask anything of you. But I want you to know that over the past few weeks, I have come to admire you deeply. Your courage, your integrity, your refusal to accept easy answers. You are. He stopped, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. You are remarkable, Lyra, and if, someday, when you are ready, you would consider allowing me to court you, I would count it the greatest honor of my very long life. Lyra stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, and she could not tell if it was panic or hope or some terrible combination of both. You want to court me? Yes, the woman whose fiancé you had killed. Harthos flinched, but he did not look away. Yes, that is, Lyra laughed, and it came out slightly unhinged. That is the worst timing I have ever heard. I know, Harthos said, and I am not asking for an answer now. I am only asking that you know, that you understand that I see you and I respect you, and if you ever want more than that, I will be here. Lyra did not know what to say. She was still grieving Thomas, still angry at the circumstances of his death, still trying to make sense of a world where vampires were real and justice was complicated, and the man who had confessed to murder was also the man who had given her the truth when he did not have to. But she also could not deny that something had shifted between them over the past few weeks, that the evenings they spent talking had felt less like interrogation and more like connection, that she had started to look forward to seeing him, to hearing his voice, to the way he listened when she spoke like every word mattered. "I need time," she said finally. "You have all the time you need," Harthos said. "I am not going anywhere." Lyra took the position as director of the new reading room. It was partly because the work mattered, and partly because she was not ready to leave, and partly because the idea of walking away from Harthos felt wrong in a way she did not want to examine too closely. The reading room was built over the next 6 months, a bright space with windows overlooking the ocean and shelves lined with records that had been hidden for centuries. Lyra catalogued them with the same care she had brought to Thomas's research, and she made sure that every human family in the region knew they could come to her with questions, concerns, or requests for information. It was slow work, and it was sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also necessary, and she was good at it. Harthos visited often. He brought her books from the archive's private collection, answered her questions about court politics, and listened when she needed to talk through a difficult decision. They did not talk about his offer to court her. They talked about everything else instead, and slowly, carefully, the space between them started to feel less like an interrogation room and more like something that might one day become friendship. And then, 8 months after the inquest, Lyra realized she was in love with him. It was not a dramatic realization. There was no lightning bolt, no sudden clarity. It was just a quiet evening in the reading room, watching Harthos explain a medieval land dispute with the kind of earnest focus that most people reserved for things that actually mattered. And Lyra thought, "Oh, this is what it feels like." She did not tell him right away. She needed time to be sure, to separate grief from affection, to make certain that what she felt was real and not just gratitude or loneliness or the desire to stop hurting. So she waited, and she watched, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. And then, one evening when they were walking along the cliffs after a long day in the archive, she stopped and said, "I think I am ready." Harthos turned to her, the wind pulling at his pale hair, and his expression was careful. "Ready for what?" "For you to court me," Lyra said. "If the offer is still open." Harthos went very still. "It is. But Lyra, you do not have to." "I know I do not have to," Lyra interrupted. "I am not saying this because I feel obligated, or because I think I owe you something. I am saying it because I want to, because I like you, because I think you are kind and honest and far more patient than anyone has a right to be, and because when I think about the future, I want you in it." Harthos stared at her, and for a moment he looked almost stunned. Then he smiled, a real smile, and it transformed his face entirely. "I would like that very much. There are conditions," Lyra said, because she needed to say this, needed him to understand. "I am not ready to be turned. I do not know if I will ever be ready. I need to stay human, at least for now, because the work I am doing matters, and it needs a mortal voice. And I still miss Thomas. I probably always will. I am not asking you to replace him or to make me forget. I am just asking if you can accept me as I am." "I would not want you any other way," Harthos said quietly. "You can stay human as long as you wish. Turning is your choice, and yours alone, and I will never ask you to make it before you are ready. And as for Thomas," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "You loved him. That is not something to forget or set aside. It is part of who you are, and I would never ask you to diminish it. I will court you knowing that part of your heart belongs to someone else, and I will count myself fortunate for whatever part you choose to give me." Lyra felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back. "You are absurdly decent, you know that. I have had a very long time to practice," Harthos said, and there was warmth in his voice that made her chest ache. They courted the old-fashioned way, because Harthos was 463 years old and had no idea how modern dating worked, and Lyra found that she did not mind. He brought her flowers from the estate gardens, left books on her desk with notes tucked inside, wrote her letters in that same museum script handwriting that she had once seen in the margins of her grief. They walked along the cliffs in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, and sometimes they sat in the reading room in comfortable silence while she worked and he read. He was careful with her always, in a way that felt less like caution and more like reverence. He asked before touching her, respected her boundaries without question, and never once pushed for more than she was ready to give. And slowly, over months that turned into a year, Lyra let herself fall the rest of the way in love with him. They talked about the future often, about what it would mean for her to stay human, about the logistics of a relationship between a mortal and an immortal, about whether she might one day choose to be turned. Harthos was firm that the decision was hers, that he would support whatever she chose, and that he had loved mortals before and knew how to carry the weight of it. "I will outlive you," he said one evening when they were sitting on the cliffs watching the sunset. "If you stay human, I will have to watch you age and sicken and die. I need you to know that I am prepared for that. It will hurt, but I choose it willingly." "What if I want to be turned?" Lyra asked. "Someday, I mean. Not now, but eventually. Then I will turn you," Harthos said. "But only when you are certain. Turning is irreversible, and I will not let you make that choice out of fear of loss or pressure from me. You must want it for yourself." Lyra nodded and thought about it and decided that she would wait. The work she was doing mattered, and it needed a human voice, someone the families could trust. She was building something important, and she wanted to see it through before she made any decisions about eternity. And in the meantime, she had Harthos, who loved her with a patience that felt like its own kind of magic. 2 years after the inquest, they were married in a small ceremony at a seaside chapel. The guest list was short. Bastian, a few of the human families Lyra had worked with, and a handful of vampires from the court who had supported the reforms. Thomas's parents were invited, and they came, and they hugged Lyra and told her that they were glad she had found happiness, and that Thomas would have wanted this for her. Lyra wore a simple dress the color of seafoam, and Harthos wore a dark suit that made him look like he had stepped out of a painting. And they exchanged vows in front of the ocean as the sun set and the stars began to appear. The vows were traditional, with one addition. Harthos promised to honor her choices, and Lyra promised to let him love her, and they both promised to face the future together, whatever it held. The reading room flourished. More families came forward with questions, with stories, with requests for information. The court implemented new protocols for oversight, and the reforms that had begun with Thomas's inquest spread to other regions. It was slow and it was difficult, but it was progress, and Lyra was proud to be part of it. She kept Thomas's letters in a box in her office, along with the annotated notes Harthos had written. She read them sometimes, when she needed to remember why the work mattered, and she did not cry as much as she used to. The grief was still there, but it had softened into something she could carry without it breaking her. Harthos was endlessly patient. He supported her work, defended her decisions to the court, and made sure she had everything she needed to succeed. He also made her laugh, brought her tea when she worked too late, and kissed her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. They talked about turning often, and eventually, after 5 years of marriage, Lyra decided she was ready. The reading room was stable, her work was established, and she had trained 2 assistants who could carry it forward. She had also realized that she wanted eternity, not because she was afraid of dying, but because she wanted more time with Harthos, more time to build and explore and love. "Are you certain?" Harthos asked when she told him. They were in their private rooms in the estate, and he was holding her hands like they were something precious. "I am certain," Lyra said. "I want this, I want you, I want forever." He turned her that night in a ceremony witnessed by the court. It was not painful exactly, but it was overwhelming. A rush of sensation and power and change that left her gasping. Harthos held her through it, his voice steady and calm, and when she opened her eyes again, the world was sharper, brighter, and full of possibilities. Baying a vampire was strange at first. The hunger, the strength, the way time felt different. But Lyra adapted, the way she had always adapted, and Harthos was there to guide her through it. They fed together, hunted together, learned together. And the reading room continued, because Lyra had built it to last, and because the work mattered whether she was mortal or not. Years passed, and then decades, and the world changed around them. The vampire courts adapted, the reading room became a model for other regions, and Lyra's work was recognized across multiple territories. She was offered positions, titles, honors, but she turned them all down. She had everything she needed, her work, her husband, and a future that stretched out before her like an endless horizon. She still thought about Thomas sometimes. She visited his grave on the anniversary of his death, left flowers, and told him about the changes she had helped bring about. She thought he would have been proud. She hoped he would have understood. And when she returned to the estate after those visits, Harthos was always waiting, ready to hold her if she needed it, or simply sit with her in silence. He never asked her to stop grieving, and she never asked him to forget that he had been part of Thomas's death. They carried it together, the weight of the past and the hope of the future, and they made it work. One evening, 100 years after their wedding, they stood on the cliffs overlooking the ocean and watched the sunset together. Lyra leaned into Harthos's side and he wrapped an arm around her, and they stood there in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Harthos asked quietly, "choosing this life?" "Never," Lyra said. "Do you regret telling me the truth?" "Never," Harthos echoed, and kissed the top of her head. They stayed there until the stars came out, and then they went back to the estate, to the reading room and the archive and the work that would continue long after they were gone. They had eternity, and they had each other, and they had built something that mattered. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.